The temperature was 14 degrees when the heavy oak door slammed behind me. The sound didn't echo. The thick, freshly fallen snow swallowed it instantly. I stood on the porch, my breath freezing into small white clouds, watching my husband of 12 years lock the deadbolt from the inside. Behind the frosted glass pane, his silhouette stood rigid, framed by his 22-year-old son, Connor. "Don't come back, Elena." David's voice carried through the wood, muffled but entirely devoid of hesitation. "A woman who would steal from her own stepson's inheritance doesn't have a place in this house. The police have already been notified. If you're still on the property in 10 minutes, you'll be leaving in handcuffs." Connor's face appeared at the window, a small, tightly controlled smirk stretching across his lips. In his right hand, he held the manila folder containing the altered ledger, the one he spent 6 months fabricating to prove I had embezzled $350,000 from his late mother's trust fund. I didn't scream. I didn't pound on the glass. When you have spent years studying blueprints, you learn that screaming at a structural collapse does not rebuild the foundation. You simply step back, evaluate the failure points, and look at the schematic. I looked down at my hands. I wasn't wearing gloves. My fingers were already turning a pale, bloodless white, the silver wedding band on my left hand feeling heavier than the brickwork of the house we built together. 12 years of building a life, stabilizing a struggling family business, and playing the role of the quiet stabilizer, erased in exactly 45 seconds because a father preferred his son's convenient lie over his wife's documented truth. David thought he was protecting his family's legacy. Connor thought he had successfully executed a corporate coup that would leave him with the entire operations of Sterling Logistics. Neither of them realized that the ground beneath their feet had shifted 6 months ago. As I turned my back to the house and walked down the unplowed driveway, my boots sinking 4 inches into the freezing powder, I reached into my coat pocket. My fingers brushed against a small, cold piece of plastic, the encrypted flash drive containing the original, unaltered banking tokens from December 14th. They thought they threw me out into a storm. They didn't realize they had just stepped into mine. Welcome back to Reality Drama Story, where family secrets unfold and quiet decisions change everything. If you are new here, drop a comment and subscribe. Now let's get into it. Every structure has a cornerstone, a single block that bears the weight of everything built above it. For me, that cornerstone was my grandfather, Arthur Vance. He wasn't a wealthy man in his early days. He was a master mason who spent 40 years working with stone and concrete in upstate New York. When I was 9 years old, my parents divorced, leaving me in his care. While other children were learning to ride bicycles, Arthur had me sitting on a wooden stool in his workshop, watching him draft structural plans on heavy amber grid paper. "Elena," he would say, his voice low and rhythmic, sounding like gravel shifting in a stream. "People will lie to you. They will construct elaborate facades, paint over dry rot, and tell you a cracked beam is just settling. Never listen to the words they paint on the wall. Look at the measurements. Look at the load-bearing joints. The math never changes its mind to please a crowd." He taught me to read ledger books the same way he read blueprints. A column of numbers wasn't just currency. It was a map of human behavior. If a man was hiding something, he wouldn't leave a massive, gaping hole in the foundation. He would shave off small fractions that didn't seem to matter until you calculated the total weight over a 10-year timeline. When I met David Sterling in the autumn of 2014, his life was a structure on the verge of a catastrophic lean. His first wife had passed away 18 months prior, leaving him with an 8-year-old son, Connor, and a family-owned shipping business that was drowning under $280,000 of short-term commercial debt. David was a passionate man, a charismatic speaker who could sell a logistics contract with a handshake, but he lacked the precision required to keep a machine running. He saw lines on a map. He didn't see the cost per mile. I didn't marry him for his business, but because I loved his vulnerability. I saw a good man trying to hold up a ceiling that was too heavy for him. For the first 5 years of our marriage, I stayed in the background. I took over the accounts at Sterling Logistics, working from a small gray metal desk in the corner of the warehouse office. I restructured their vendor agreements, negotiated 30-day extensions on their high-interest fuel lines, and quietly paid off the principal debt by November 12, 2019. But as the business grew sturdier, the domestic foundation began to rot from within. Connor didn't see the hours I spent under the fluorescent lights while he was away at private boarding schools. He didn't see the $42,000 of my own inheritance money that I injected into the company's payroll during the shipping freeze of 2021. To Connor, I wasn't the architect who saved his family's name. I was an intruder, a tenant occupying a space that belonged exclusively to his memory of his mother. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, didn't help. She was a woman who measured human value by lineage, and to her, I was an outsider from a working-class background. She visited the house exactly twice a year, always carrying a vintage silver teapot that belonged to David's first wife, placing it prominently on the dining room table as a silent boundary line. "A family's bloodline is like a fine timber, David," Beatrice would remark during Sunday dinners, her eyes drifting over my head as if I were a pane of clear glass. "You can reinforce it with steel plates, but it's the original grain that holds the value. One must be careful about who handles the keys to the estate." Connor absorbed her silence. He learned to weaponize it. By the time he turned 20, he began working at the firm as a junior coordinator. He didn't ask questions about operations. He asked questions about access. He wanted to know who held the primary bank signatures, where the corporate deeds were filed, and why a stepmother should have final approval over a legacy that bore his last name. I watched him closely. I saw the way he began taking meetings with our secondary vendors without my knowledge. He would order $4,000 of office supplies from companies that didn't exist, using accounts that bypassed my desk. He was clumsy at first, leaving digital footprints that took me exactly 12 minutes to trace. I didn't confront him immediately. I simply noted the anomalies in a separate black notebook, checking the timestamps against the office security cameras. He was preparing a narrative. He was shifting the dirt around the foundation, waiting for the right moment to pull the supports. The turning point occurred on October 3, 2025. David had gone to Chicago to finalize a multi-year regional freight contract with an automotive supplier, a contract that would increase our annual volume by 24%. While he was away, I received a secure notification from our primary commercial lender, Empire State Trust. A request had been submitted to open a secondary line of credit for $450,000, using the warehouse property at 410 Industrial Parkway as collateral. The digital authorization attached to the request bore my electronic signature, time-stamped at 2:14 a.m. on September 28th. I didn't panic. I sat down at my desk, opened the system logs, and checked the IP address used to submit the document. It originated from a terminal inside the warehouse office, specifically the computer assigned to Connor Sterling. He had used a keystroke logger to capture my password 3 weeks earlier during a routine systems migration. Connor didn't understand how deep my roots went into that financial institution. He thought Empire State Trust was just an automated system that processed data packets. He didn't know that the senior vice president of commercial lending was a man named Thomas Miller, the very first apprentice my grandfather Arthur had trained 40 years ago. Thomas didn't see an automated request. He saw an anomaly that didn't align with my established 12-year borrowing pattern. I called Thomas on his private line at 9:15 a.m. "Elena," Thomas said, his voice dropping into the familiar, precise register he used when analyzing a balance sheet. "The signature matches your digital certificate, but the underlying terms are highly irregular. The funds are routed to an offshore entity registered in Delaware under the name North Star Holdings. Are you restructuring?" "No, Thomas," I replied, my voice perfectly level. I want you to place a temporary administrative hold on that application. Do not reject it. Do not flag it as fraudulent in the system. Simply change its status to pending manual audit. And Thomas, I need you to execute a specific legal instrument we discussed 3 years ago. That instrument was a cross-collateralization indemnity clause, integrated into the Master Operating Agreement of Sterling Logistics on June 14, 2022. It was a clause David had signed during a routine corporate restructuring when we converted the business from a sole proprietorship to an LLC to lower our tax liabilities. David hadn't read the 16 pages of fine print. He had simply trusted me when I told him it was necessary to protect the business from personal liability. The clause stated very clearly, in the event of an unauthorized or fraudulent attempt by any junior member or non-founding officer to encumber corporate assets, the entire voting control and 75% of the physical real estate titles automatically transfer to the primary financial officer me to prevent corporate dissolution. Furthermore, on December 14, 2025, I had quietly moved all primary operational accounts into a private, multi-signature trust fund. To move a single dollar out of that fund, the system required 2 separate physical security keys, one held by me and one held in a secure safety deposit box at Thomas Miller's branch. Connor had spent 6 months painting a picture of an embezzling stepmother. He had spent months changing numbers on his local copy of the QuickBooks file, creating fake invoices to show that I had transferred $350,000 into a personal account over the last 3 years. He thought that by presenting this fabricated folder to David, he could force my immediate removal from the company and the home. He didn't realize he was playing with a mock-up model while I was holding the actual structural blueprints. He was stealing numbers from a screen. I already owned the physical concrete beneath his feet. The final confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened at the annual Sterling Logistics Founders Dinner on January 15, 2026. The venue was the Grand Ballroom at the Riverside Manor, an upscale catering hall adorned with crystal chandeliers and heavy gold drapery. There were 84 people in attendance, 42 of our full-time drivers, 12 dispatchers, 7 warehouse managers, and 31 local business owners who relied on our fleet to move their inventory. David sat at the head table, looking robust and successful in a dark charcoal suit. To his right sat his mother, Beatrice, wearing her vintage pearls. To his left sat Connor, who spent the entire evening checking his watch and smiling at our top 3 corporate clients. I sat next to David, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting quietly in my lap. I wore a simple black dress with no jewelry except my wedding band. Throughout the 3-hour event, I didn't speak more than 40 words. I didn't complain about the food. I didn't join in the laughter. I simply observed. I counted the details. It is a habit I learned from Arthur. Connor stood up to give the keynote address at exactly 8:45 p.m. During his 12-minute speech, he used the phrase "my father's company" exactly 14 times. He mentioned his late mother's foundational vision 7 times. He didn't use my name once. Not a single time. He spoke about the future of Sterling Logistics as a pure bloodline legacy, his voice rising with an artificial confidence that sounded like a cheap engine revving too high. David watched him with tears in his eyes, his hand reaching over to squeeze Connor's shoulder as the room erupted into applause from the drivers. They saw a young prince ascending the throne. They didn't see the structural cracks running through the entire presentation. As the applause died down, Connor leaned over the microphone, his expression turning grave, his eyes locking onto me with cold calculation. "Before we conclude tonight," Connor said, his voice echoing through the dual-channel PA system, "there is an administrative matter we must address. A family business cannot survive without absolute integrity. Over the last 48 hours, we have discovered a catastrophic breach of trust within our own executive office. A breach that threatens the very payroll of the men and women sitting in this room." The ballroom went perfectly silent. I could hear the hum of the industrial refrigerator from the kitchen behind us. David shifted in his seat, his face hardening as he looked down at the table. He didn't look at me. He had already seen the fabricated folder Connor had given him 3 hours before the dinner. Connor reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a stack of printed financial ledgers. We have documented evidence that over the last 36 months, our head of accounting has diverted $350,000 of operational capital into an unauthorized private account. As of tonight, that individual has been stripped of all operational authority. He looked directly at me. The entire room followed his gaze. 84 people stared at me, some with confusion, some with immediate judgment, some with genuine shock. I didn't blink. I didn't stand up to defend myself. I sat perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the silver cake fork resting on the white linen tablecloth. The fork was exactly 6 inches long. The pattern on the handle consisted of 12 small, engraved ridges. I counted them twice. If this story is hitting close, drop a comment and stay with me because what happens next is something none of them were ready for. 3 hours later, we were back at the house. The temperature had dropped significantly, and a heavy winter gale was driving wet, thick snow against the windows of the living room. David stood by the fireplace, his coat still on, his chest heaving as he paced the length of the hardwood floor. Connor stood near the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, acting as the silent enforcer. "How could you do it, Elena?" David finally broke the silence, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and genuine exhaustion. 12 years. I gave you my name, my home, my trust, and you treated my company like your personal piggy bank. Connor showed me the transfers. The dates align perfectly with your private logins. The dates align with his logins, David, I said, my voice perfectly calm, low, and rhythmic. I sat on the edge of the leather armchair, my hands folded over my purse. If you check the routing numbers on page 14 of that folder, you'll find they don't lead to my bank. They lead to a registered LLC called North Star Holdings, a company formed in Dover, Delaware, on March 11th of last year. Connor stepped forward, his eyes widening slightly before he quickly masked it with a sneer. "Don't try to spin your way out of this, Elena. The corporate tokens were used. You're the only one who has access to the master key." "I was the only one who had access, Connor," I replied, looking directly into his eyes. "Until you installed a software logger on the terminal in Warehouse Office B on September 14th at 11:22 p.m. The security system recorded your phone's MSC address connecting to the local area network at that exact timestamp." "You're lying," Connor shouted, his voice cracking, losing its polished boardroom veneer. He turned to David. "Dad, look at her. She's trying to confuse you with technical jargon. She's an outsider. She's always hated that this business belongs to us." David looked between us, his face drawn in gray. He was a man who couldn't read a blueprint, torn between the son who carried his DNA and the wife who carried his reality. The weight of his mother's lifelong whispers about bloodlines was pulling him down into a predictable choice. "Enough," David said, his voice turning cold as stone. He walked over to the front door and threw it open. The wind howled through the opening, carrying a flurry of white powder across the polished threshold. "I don't care about your explanations, Elena. I trust my son. Pack your personal clothes and get out. You're done here." That was the moment described at the beginning of this document. The moment I walked into the snow without an argument, knowing that an argument is just empty noise when the structural calculations are already complete. I walked 3 blocks to the local diner, the 24-hour Highway Star, where the air smelled of stale coffee and old grease. I sat in a vinyl booth in the back corner, took out my phone, and dialed Thomas Miller's private number. It was 1:15 a.m. "It's time, Thomas," I said simply. "Execute the manual audit and trigger the default clause on the industrial property." Notify the regional freight clients that the primary operational accounts have been frozen due to a compliance breach by a junior officer. The paperwork will hit their corporate fax and email servers at exactly 8 a.m., Elena. Thomas replied. Are you warm? I am perfectly warm, Thomas, I said, looking out the window as the snow continued to pile against the glass. At 8:30 a.m. the next morning, the storm had cleared, leaving behind 7 inches of pristine, glittering ice. I arrived at the Sterling Logistics corporate headquarters in a standard commercial cab. I wasn't wearing my winter coat. I was wearing a tailored black wool trench coat, holding a leather briefcase that belonged to my grandfather Arthur. When I entered the main office, the atmosphere was completely chaotic. All 3 dispatch monitors were flashing red with system alerts. The phones were ringing continuously, a frantic chorus of 22 lines, all buzzing simultaneously. David was standing in the middle of the room, his tie undone, his face completely pale as he held a printed document from our largest client, Great Lakes Auto. Connor was sitting at the computer terminal, his fingers frantically slamming against the keyboard, his face drenched in sweat. What did you do, Elena? David whispered as I walked in, his voice trembling as he held up the paper. Great Lakes just canceled their morning pickups. They say our operating authority has been suspended by the bank. Our fuel cards are declined. The drivers are refusing to start their rigs because their digital paychecks were recalled by the clearinghouse. I didn't do anything irregular, David, I said, placing my briefcase on the counter with a quiet, solid click. I simply enforced the terms of the agreement you signed on June 14, 2022. When Connor attempted to secure a fraudulent $450,000 line of credit using the warehouse as collateral, he triggered the safety systems. Connor stood up, his chair flying backward, crashing against the metal filing cabinet. You can't do this. This is my father's company. You're just a standard employee. Actually, Connor, if you look at the master title certificate filed with the county clerk at 8:02 a.m. this morning, I said, opening my briefcase and sliding a certified document across the counter, you'll see that Sterling Logistics LLC has been dissolved due to an incurable insolvency event caused by your unauthorized borrowing attempt. The physical assets, the 24 trucks, the 14 trailers, and the warehouse property at 410 Industrial Parkway have been transferred to Vance Asset Management. That is my company. David stared at the document, his eyes tracking the numbers. He saw the figure. $1,240,000, the exact appraisal value of the real estate, now listed under my exclusive ownership. He saw the date, June 14, 2022, the date he thought he was just signing a standard tax form. Connor fell back against the desk, his face completely hollow. He tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a landing gear mechanism trying to engage without hydraulic pressure. Dad, do something. Call the lawyers. She can't just take everything. With what money, Connor? I asked, my voice remaining perfectly level, calm, and measured. The corporate accounts are currently holding a balance of exactly $14.32. The remaining capital has been moved to a secure escrow account at Empire State Trust pending a federal investigation into your Delaware shell company. David looked up from the paper, his eyes completely hollow. He looked like an old building whose primary support wall had just been knocked out by a single blow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, old object, a tarnished brass key to the front door of the warehouse. The very first key we bought together when we cleared the debt in 2019. He set it on the counter with a trembling hand. Elena, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Please. The drivers have families. This business is all we have. The drivers will be paid, David, I said, picking up the brass key and sliding it into my pocket. I have already issued new independent contractor agreements to all 42 of them under Vance Logistics. Their trucks will move at 10 a.m. Their families won't lose a single dime. But you and Connor no longer have access to this yard. Your personal effects have been packed into 4 standard boxes currently sitting by the loading dock. I turned around and walked toward the glass exit doors. I didn't look back to see the tears that were finally starting to fall down David's face, or the silent, trembling fury of his son. I had the blueprints in my hand, and the measurements were exactly where they needed to be. If this story reminded you to know your worth, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, drop a comment, and I will see you in the next one.